What content do you remember from your last exam? How about the author of the last book you read? What did you eat for lunch on Thursday 2 weeks ago? Can't remember? Me neither. Our brain is constantly hit with information, so it needs to be very good at clearing out the unnecessary junk. What you had for lunch 2 weeks ago, your brain decided, rightly so, wasn't essential information. That information is not stored, it's deleted. It's gone. There's no recovering it from the trash. But what if you need to remember something? What if you need to remember something important, like the 6-digit number code to your phone? Or if you're a medical student like me, the treatment for an ST elevation myocardial infarction. In regards to your phone, you always know the code. You didn't study the code to your phone. If I asked you right now, what's your code? You probably wouldn't tell me because you don't want me to have access to your phone, but you would know it in your head. You know your phone cold because you're constantly testing yourself on that piece of information. Without realizing it, you are practicing spaced repetition every time you open up your phone. However, to remember the treatment for an ST elevation myocardial infarction, or STEMI, I need to study that. If I don't study that repeatedly and test myself on that information regularly, I won't remember it very long. Studies show, in fact, that we forget around 75% of the information we learned within a 48-hour period. That's not so good. So how do we fix that? The best answer I have found, and many other people have found, is spaced repetition. Spaced repetition, along with active recall and practice testing, have made the biggest improvement to my studying and my test scores since I started medical school a year ago. Hey guys, I'm Zach. I'm a medical student in Philadelphia, if you don't know me. I've spoken about active recall and practice testing in a previous video, so if you want to go check that video out, it'll be right one of these areas. I will focus on spaced repetition for this video. It's the final piece of the ultimate kind of content retention puzzle. After learning about spaced repetition from YouTubers and a bunch of my classmates, I finally began actually implementing it 3 months into medical school. Now I see why people always talk about it and why it's got such good rep. My content retention is so much better and my exam score is better too. It doesn't necessarily have to be applied to learning scientific information, that's just how I use it. So what will we talk about in this video? Well, this video will talk about the evidence for spaced repetition and how I actually implement it. I also have another video on my specific Anki settings and workflow, which if you want, you can check it out. I'll put it in the description. So the first time we study something, we forget it very quickly. The next time we study that same thing, we forget that piece of information a little less quickly, and the next time even less quickly. And so eventually you can remember that piece of information for a long period of time. Ebbinghaus, in 1880 named this idea the forgetting curve. Now it is important to realize that many other factors come into play when you're talking about memory, such as your senses and emotion. However, when we have to remember boring facts, like what Ebbinghaus did is he had his subjects memorize really nonsense words such as zuck and quacks. On those boring pieces of information, our memory will likely fall along his forgetting curve. So what happens when you learn something is you rapidly fall off this forgetting curve. You rapidly forget that information over time. So how do we beat the forgetting curve? Well, we just test ourselves on the information right before we fall off that curve. What you see in this graph is that if you test yourself just as you start to fall off the forgetting curve, you can save your attention. So the first time you test yourself, the slope is pretty steep, but the next time it's a little less steep, and a little less steep, until we are pretty good at remembering this information for a good amount of time. This is the power of spaced repetition. When do we test ourselves? When do we ask ourselves these questions again? Is the spacing of the testing important? Is it once a day, twice a day, once every 3 days, once a week, or does it not really matter? One experiment took 250 students and had them study 60 physiology concepts. One set of students reviewed the 60 concepts at fixed intervals, so at 1 day post-learning, 10 days post-learning, 20 days post-learning. And another set of students reviewed the 60 concepts at expanding intervals, so 1 day post-learning, 6 days post-learning, 16 days post-learning. So there was a difference in the spacing between when they studied this information. The experimental groups reviewed the 60 pieces of information the same amount of time, but just at different time intervals. Finally, one group just didn't review the information at all. I don't think they did very well, we'll find out. All groups then took a final test at day 29. Who did the best? Well, students who used the expanding interval, so taking different times between studying the information, scored 14% greater than the students with the fixed interval, and 36% greater than the students that studied nothing at all. Let's look at another review article from Yale, and what they said is whenever students learn factual knowledge, they should test themselves while learning. Actively recall information and retest the facts at expanding time intervals to make learning in medical school most effective. These learning strategies help students learn the most in the least amount of time. Spaced repetition is important. I think we have established that by now, but how do we actually implement spaced repetition? How do you know when you should practice the information? Luckily, the cliche term holds true. There is an app for that. The app is Anki. It's what I use. It's what a bunch of other students use, but you can use stuff like Quizlet, Excel sheets, physical flashcards. But in my experience, Anki is just the best. Anki is an electronic flashcard application that implements this expanding interval via its own specially crafted algorithm that works. It also syncs with my phone, my computer, my iPad. So for example, when I learn a piece of information, Anki will estimate when I will fall off that forgetting curve. If you want to see how specifically I set up my Anki, like what settings I use, what workflow I do on an average day, I have a video linked in below, which kind of is in the nitty-gritty of how I set it up. I really like Anki. Again, I think I've said it multiple times. I use it every day, and it just makes spaced repetition easy for you. So, in summary, without purposeful learning, we will forget what we learn. Spaced repetition helps us retain more information by testing us at the time just before we start to fall off the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve basically means that once we learn something, we're going to fall off that curve. Active recall and spaced repetition can help save us from falling off that curve and significantly improve our chances of remembering that information in the long term. Anki automates the spaced repetition timeline and therefore long-term knowledge of whatever subject you are learning. So thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. I know when I started medical school, I heard about Anki and spaced repetition and flashcards, and I just had no idea how to get started, so I wanted to make this video for other people who are kind of confused. So hopefully this helped, even if only a little bit. See you in the next one.